So welcome everyone to this IUCN WCPA Vital Sites event, Understanding the Role of Protected Areas as Nature-Based Solutions, part 2 of a 2-part series.
Thanks very much for joining this webinar. It's one of a series of 2, and in last week's webinar we looked at guidance on the contributions of area-based conservation to the Sustainable Development Goals and how this can be translated into financial returns to help protected area management and to support local communities. And I'm sure we can probably put up in the link box the link to the recording of that webinar if you weren't there. So today's webinar, we're going to really focus down on some tools and guidance for assessing and accounting nature-based solutions from protected and conserved areas. We're specifically going to talk about the Protected Area Benefits Assessment tool, the PA-BAT, which is a kind of cost-effective participatory approach to identifying economic and non-economic benefits, and hear from a couple of places that it's been used in. And then we're going to conclude this webinar and the webinar series on some recommendations for more consistent reporting mechanisms for benefits, really based on our attempts to collect this kind of information over the last 20 years and the difficulties of getting consistent data. So we have 4 presentations today. And a couple of panel events, so you can ask questions. Please use the Q&A boxes or the chat boxes to ask questions, and we'll also post some links to the reports and more information in those boxes. The panelists will introduce themselves as they start, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen, which always takes a minute or 2, and we'll introduce the Protected Area Benefit Assessment tool. So hopefully this will come up into full screen mode in a second. Please. There we go. So yeah, hello, I'm Sue Stolton. I'm a part of Equilibrium Research with my partner Nigel Dudley. And I'm going to start by sort of looking back a bit over almost 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, we started really thinking that we wanted to talk a lot more about the wider benefits of protected areas. Biodiversity obviously is the core for protected areas, but we needed to start selling the concept behind protected areas more widely. And we looked at the provision of water, which was I think back in 2002, religious links to religious beliefs, to food, to health and well-being, and to disaster risk reduction. And then we came to trying to look at sort of the wider economic and social benefits of protected areas, and found that it was quite difficult to get information in a consistent way to report. And this was back in 2008, and it was actually linked with the CBD's deadline at that time for its programme of work on protected areas, the PALPA, for any of those of you that were around that time long ago, which was specifically looking for mechanisms for equitable sharing both of costs and benefits arising from the establishment and management of protected areas. So that really led us into what became quite a long-term involvement in something that became the Protected Area Benefit Assessment tool, really based on this kind of diagram which came out of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but has been much used about the varying different services and values from protected areas. So we set about trying to develop a tool. And I think one thing to say here is that we are specifically looking at benefits, and over the past few years, quite a lot of tools have been developed to look at other things like governance, equity, and the social impact of protected areas through a lot of acronyms, SAPA, GAPA, and SAGA, and SAGE rather. And I think hopefully we can put a link up to where you can find more information about those kind of assessments. But for the PA-BAT, we specifically wanted to look at or develop a tool that could look at the full range of potential values from protected areas, but that could be adaptable globally for individual sites around the world, that is to say. We wanted to understand the broad range of economic and non-economic benefits from these values, but not do a detailed economic evaluation. There are other tools for that. We wanted to assess both current and potential benefits from individual protected and conserved areas. look specifically at legal resource use, which is obviously not to say that illegal resource use isn't a really key issue in protected areas, but and that does come up in the discussion, but the actual assessment looks at legal resource use. Who benefits? We wanted to develop a tool that was really based on stakeholder knowledge, and a tool that could be used as a kind of scoping study for more detailed assessments. So we came up eventually with this PA-BAT, the Protected Area Benefit Assessment Tool, which took several years to develop. Because all these things are difficult. We've also developed over the years the Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool, which is also a well-known and widely used tool, but they're not easy to come up with. It seems like a great idea when you decide you're going to do it, but then you wish you hadn't had the idea, to be honest, when you try developing them. So the PA-BAT basically has a standardized typology of values and associated benefits, which produces a kind of an aggregated results, which can be used from an individual site or across a portfolio of sites. It's not a score. It's really important to say it's not a score. Looking at protected area benefits is not a competition amongst sites who's got the most benefits. Protected areas are about biodiversity, but they can also be about other values as well. We wanted a tool that was really easy to use and most importantly, easy to translate. I can't remember the exact number of words, but I think you can get away with translating a couple of hundred words to use this in the field, although the guidance document at the moment is just in English. It can be adapted for relevance. Protected areas are so different around the world, as we know. And we wanted something that was truly participatory and that encouraged dialogue and mutual understanding and consensus between stakeholders. So fast forward to 2020, it was supposed to be launched at the World Conservation Congress, but there we go. So the tool has been used around the world, and we think it is an easy tool to use, but it was clear that we needed more guidance. Concepts around values and benefits are quite complex. Any kind of stakeholder process needs careful planning and attention. So we put together this very detailed guidance document with all the people that are talking today. So we all had a role in this, and it was published as one of the IUCN technical series. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but this is the kind of the contents list, and you can see it's really detailed about, what is this tool, how you use it, how you communicate the results, and some case studies from around the world. And we're going to hear today from a couple of those case studies. But what is the PA-BAT? It's basically made up of 3 elements. It's a list of benefits that are likely to come from protected areas. It's a list of stakeholders who could receive those benefits, so it looks at the flow of benefits, and it's a really simple assessment system that looks at just economic, non-economic and potential benefits. And all of these elements should be and must be adapted for wherever you're using the PA-BAT. It needs to be appropriate to the site it's being used in. So how do we put that together? Well, you can see all of the lists, and this is all in from the PA-BAT, and I'm not going to go through all these details, but we have this list of potential values, we have a list of potential stakeholders, and we have this list of 7 different types of assessment. And I say these are the bits that should be adapted, but between those 3 lists, you make up a tool that can get quite a lot of information from it. And this is what the tool can kind of look like. It's the benefits. So I've just picked one specific benefit here, which is about pollination, but we have a list of potential benefits from the site. We then have a list of potential beneficiaries of those benefits, which go from local people to either national or maybe possibly even international audiences. And then in the second little table there, you can see that we have this really simple assessment system where basically 1+ means that it has a small amount of non-economic benefit, 2+ means it has major, $1 sign means that there's a minor economic impact, and $2 signs means that there's a major economic benefit, and plus the P is potential. So how we get to making these assessments is through workshops with stakeholders. And the reason that we did the tool like this is that it's really easy to use, hopefully easy to use and adapt. We have some standard PowerPoints which can be easily translated. Here's a translated version through PowerPoint. But the system's kind of so simple that actually you can also use it if you're using it somewhere with no power. So here's a version of what we did in Colombia with just a paper version and sticking on pluses and minuses. So it's very adaptable and easy to use in that way. You can get straight into it with stakeholders, really. It doesn't take an awful lot of explanation. People understand pluses and dollar signs very quickly. So you can kind of hold it anywhere. Restaurants seem to be a very popular one for holding it in. Certainly in the project we did in the Derrick Arc, there was an awful lot of restaurants involved. Community halls, or even out in the open air where there's no power. So that was one of the other thinking behind the tool, that it would be really easy to use. So I'm not going to go into how we use the tool, because I'm going to pass on to my colleagues to talk a little bit about the tool, and particularly about how the results we used, because a tool is only as good as how you can collect the results and use the results in the end. But as I say, please say hello and pop any questions in the chat box or in the Q&A. And thank you for signing up to the webinar. I'm going to stop and pass on to my colleague Cassandra, who is going to introduce one of the rollouts of the PA-BAT. Thank you.
Hi everyone, just a second to start sharing it. Okay, can you see it? Okay.
Yes, that's perfect.
Great, thank you. Hi, my name is Cassandra Zorica Ivanic. I'm coming from Croatia, and I was part of the whole process of collecting data in the Western Balkans region, using the PA-BAT tool, and I'm working for WWF Adria. So here you can see one of beautiful protected area that we have visited. It's Plitvice Lake. It's a UNESCO site in Croatia, and you can see kind of major ecosystems. It's a karst system, and the water is one of the major resources that we have in our region. So let me start. We have done the assessment in the 8 countries. So you can see it's Western Balkans country, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, Albania, North Macedonia. Main ecosystems that are in the region are marine, freshwater, forest, and we also have important wildlife governance and protected areas program as part of a WWF work in the region. Here you can see a logo of our partner, and also that we initiated. It is a Parks Dynarad, which is a network of protected areas in the region. It is important to mention that the region is, let's say, post-war, and this was the first time opportunity to actually connect protected area practitioners and the local communities in work. So why we have used the PA-BAT? Because it was an opportunity to identify different values, so existential subsistence values, but also economic, to see to whom the flow of economic benefits goes, and to assess the main drivers of the protected area development, but also the degradation of protected areas by using its natural resources. It was an opportunity to see the communication gaps that occurred between locals and the PA managers. And this was an important kind of byproduct of the whole assessment, because let's say the culture of participation, it's not really, it is quite new in the region we are working. So this was a first time opportunity for them to actually communicate and exchange knowledge. So in the positive side of it, we collected great story, local knowledge, and enabled networking of the stakeholders. But also we have seen that there was a lot of illegal activities going on, law overlapping on the fishery, forestry, nature conservation, and unfortunately a lot of endemic corruption happening in the area. So that's beyond capturing the results on the workshops. So you can see on, I don't know if you see my cursor, but let's say on the map, you can see all the green dots which are presenting protected areas that we have assessed. So it's 8 countries and 58 protected areas that we have visited and talked with local stakeholders in the area. In that manner, we have assessed more than 50% of protected area in the region, which is all national parks and partially some nature parks. So it's IUCN second and the fourth category. All of the data that we have collected has been published on natureforpeople.org. So I do recommend that after this webinar, you could go to the webpage and explore it a bit more. What is a major thing? We have like more than 22,000 data gathered from participants, and more than 1,300 people participated. The big thing behind it, it was the first time opportunity for local community, for all the fishermen, beekeepers, women association actually to come in together with the protected area staff and manager and to discuss stuff. It was really in some cases there were some conflicts, but in the end it was an opportunity to see perception of each other, of the role of the PAs, and how a local community actually perceives their work and natural resource management that they're doing. As I said, it's not only about capturing the results and the data, but also the process. It is a credible data from the local community, from the field. It is a quite efficient and inexpensive process because it's a one-day workshop, and it's important that you have staff who is covering it. Neutral facilitation, in our case, it was WWF leading the process, and we were a neutral facilitator between the PA staff and the local community, local stakeholders. It was a learning opportunity for all sides involved, for the PA staff, but also for the local communities to see what values protected area provides to different groups living in the area. It was important for making connection between the protected area staff, local stakeholders, but also between local stakeholders. Collecting stories, storytelling is a great tool in presenting the value of protected area, value of nature, and it was also a good tool for that, and understanding reality. It is not, sitting somewhere in the office and assessing the values, but actually talking with the people and gathering their perception. In that way, we have used human rights-based approach. So local community rights to information, to participation. It was a non-discriminatory equality because we have involved different vulnerable groups in the process. We were involving, let's say, women associations so that there is a kind of equal representatives. To be honest, it was not easy, especially in some rural area and in some cultures and countries we have worked. So we had, let's say, side workshops where we have discussed this with women. We were quite transparent with the results that we have gathered. So it's all published on the Nature for People webpage and disseminated to the PA management. And in a way, accountability, because PA staff was kind of confronted by local community by some of the on some of the topics that we have assessed. So the workshop per se, maybe it's too detailed, but in our case, we need to have a support from the ministry or agency in charge of protected area. We had focal points in each protected area. The focal points invited local communities, different users, involved in marginalized groups, and they have covered the logistics. It was really important to have it in local venue and in presenting local offer. It was a networking and also opportunity for locals to present their offer. It's important for this facilitator to do the research about the protected area, to read the management plan, all the documents to understand the reasoning before the workshop. So the venue, it's what's interesting here, it's really the questionnaire. the feedback from the local community on the quality of our work. And for the facilitator, we have it really well described in the PA-BOT Plus guidance. It is important that a facilitator knows the basic of conflict resolution, because in some cases where parties didn't connect before, or there's kind of bad blood, that you need to be prepared for it. Yeah, and we have recorded the result using various data sheets and notes. So we have used the PowerPoint presentation to capture the result. And here we organize it. It was kind of evolution of gathering the data. First, it was in a form of Excel table, not really user-friendly. Then we, over time, used kind of different Excel tables, which generates tables while clicking different filters. And here we have this kind of final page, which is Nature for People, where you can choose from the drop-down menu a country, and you can do the country analysis by some of the graphs, such as overall values, overall economic flow of economic value or mean potential, or you can pick individual protected areas. I've picked 2 examples. Here is an overview for a national economic value for 13 national parks in Albania, where we can see low and high economic values assessed by local communities. We can see that it's really high economic values coming from water, but also livestock grazing and tourism. I've used a different ecosystem. Here is a nature park Lastovo. It's the entire island is actually a nature park. And because it's a lower level of protection, some of the resource could be used for economic value. So we have a really high for fishing, because it's an island and island ecosystem, but the tourism has a quite high importance, and also nature conservation, because people are coming there, scientists, and they are bringing that in that way money to the local community. So here I would really like to present the values on a regional scale. So we can see that tourism, water, forestry, and jobs are the most valued. I will focus here, let's say, on the forestry, just to name that forestry in countries, some countries, not Slovenia and Croatia, are actually protected areas are being financed through natural resource use. So protected areas are cutting their own forest in order to provide jobs for an income for the PA management, which is not really according to how we perceive nature conservation, but it is how it's done in some of the countries in the region. And our goal with the whole assessment is to find ways how to support PA management without actually destroying natural resource that they should be protected. Also, we can see that jobs in protected areas are quite high. In 25% of protected areas, PA's management jobs are the only income, because no other opportunity exists. In 58 protected areas, majority of them are in rural mountainous area. That's why this is really important. And it is, I've put a picture here of local community member who is also working for a national park Krka in Croatia, and he's dressed in the a local, let's say, traditional clothes, and he's also keeping traditional crafts. So he's kind of capturing the culture, but his job is to presenting it to tourism. To tourists that are visiting protected area. So in that way, protected area is capturing, let's say, old knowledges. Here is a picture of nature park, Loinsko Polje, and what it's not really visible on the graph before are actually ecosystem services. What we have noticed in the assessment, that ecosystem services and its values are recognized the least in the region, and in most of the cases they are taken for granted, or there is absolutely lack of awareness of their role for natural system, and that what they play in regulating, let's say, climate stabilization, soil or flood prevention. And this was also learning opportunity for local communities about the ecosystem services, but this is something that should be taken in consideration while working with the PA staff and the local communities in the future. So we can see that tourism has the highest economic values. So 96% of protected area receive some economic gain from tourism, while half of them have major economic benefit. What we have noticed is that flow of benefits are going to different stakeholders and that they are quite uneven. In some cases, this goes mainly to the government and large business sector, and our strategy should be to have it distributed more even and more for the local community. The second value, which is really high regarding income, because in PA-BAT we can only use $1 or $2 sign, but through the discussion and notes you can see that the income is really high from commercial water use. So in almost half of assessed protected area, some of the stakeholder groups are having income from water. This comes from bottling water companies, so in 16 PAs, but in 18 protected areas, it's because of the hydropower plants, which are not really in line with the conservation and what the protected area should do, but they're gaining money from concession of hydropower plants in their area, I mean the protected area management. Also, some capitals, so Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Tirana and in Albania, are providing water purification, or protected area nearby are providing water purification services for almost a million inhabitants nearby. So it's really important that protected areas are providing pure water for a local community. Here. So in 60% of protected area, food values are really high, not only for subsistence, but also for economic value. Livestock grazing is one of the highest, but we also have wild food plants and mushrooms, fishing, honey production, and we can see also hunting later on. And some strategies should be, let's say, thought about how to use it in a sustainable way, especially when we talk about medicinal plants. So here we can see that there is uneven distribution of economic benefits in PAs. We see that majority is going to the business sector and the governments, and that the shift should be to local community. So this tool also enable us to see this on a regional, national, but also on a local scale for individual protected area. And what is kind of our role is that economic development of PAs and nearby areas is that to shift from traditional use of natural resource such as water, mining, fishing, hunting, to maybe sustainable tourism, cultural, and more educational aspects. So regarding stakeholder feedback, I have shared that we have developed a questionnaire where we assessed, where we gathered the feedback from the participants on the workshop. And you can see that more than 1,200 people said that they would like to develop future collaboration with some of the stakeholders, colleagues that they met on the workshop for the first time. And as a feedback, we gathered that there were initiatives happening, project developed, and improved collaboration between local stakeholders and the PA management after initial workshops. So how we have used the results? We have used them for developing national reports where we have identified challenges in the PA governance. We have developed recommendations for improving the governance, but also the legislation on nature protection and some other sectoral laws. use it also for strategic documents, not only on regarding nature conservation, but also tourism and rural development, and as a basis for dialogue with different ministries and corporates. And I have mentioned here hydropower and also on the EU delegation. So the results on a local level, but also on a national, could be used for the management planning process, business planning on local level, different communication strategies, system level policies, different sectoral dialogues, because different sectors are, working in protected and around a protected area. Initial ecosystem services assessment, so setting a baseline and perception. The results could be used for interpretation and also education, and seeing where the gaps in education of the local stakeholders, rural development projects, and hopefully mobilizing and generating funding options. I've shared an example how individual results could be used for the management plan development in order to see the link between values and the management objectives. Also to assess the gaps between the management objectives and the PA-BAT results, comparison of the priorities when you see the results from the PA-BAT workshop and the management plan, and some of the recommendations could derive from the PA-BAT workshops for the improving the management plan. The idea is to have an equitable flow of benefits, both to protected area, businesses, government, but local people, local stakeholders. Here are the examples of some of the reports we have developed. There are 6 of them, and you can find them on the Nature for People webpage. And the results also could be used on the international level. And that is from me. If you have questions, comments, I'm here. Thank you.
Okay, we have got a few questions up on the chat and in the questions, but we're going to come to that after Carolina's presentation. So Cara, maybe over to you.
Thank you, Nigel, and hi everyone. Thanks for connecting and sharing today during this webinar about our PA-BAT experience. So I will share with you today some of the process that we lived through in Colombia to implement PA-BAT over the past years. So we have 3 main implementations in Colombia, and I'll share with you as well what have those 3 implementations led to. But I think this is very interesting for you to know that PA-BAT is possible to do it in different types of scenarios. So first, we did the PA-BAT in an Amazon protected area in the Amazon region in Colombia and in the Piedmont. And this park was very important because it is connected to the Andes mountains to the Amazon region through a corridor. So the park is creating this corridor. So we implemented one in this region where there is indigenous people, there are other like local stakeholders like the parks authorities, mayor's office, and so on. The second implementation of PA-BAT was in a set of protected areas. So that means that we didn't have just one protected area, but we had different types of protected areas and different types of IUCN protected areas. We had a regional one, we had a private one, and we have a national protected area. This was in a park located in the Andes region, in the mountains, very important for water provision. So that was the second implementation. So let me just give you some background context on why we did these 2 implementation in these 2 places. Oops, sorry. It's not leaving me. So this happened during a project that we implemented with Luke Hoffman Institute, WWF, and the Parks Authority in Colombia, Equilibrium Research, of course, and the Australian National University. And so we had a research question, and the question was, how do we plan for climate change in protected areas? So having in mind that question, we came with a set of tools and ideas on how to guide the planning process so that it includes in an effective manner climate change. So one of the things we realized that was very important is to understand how ecosystem services and protected areas values are going to change over time because of climate change. And these led us to use the PA-BAT. Of course, Nigel was part of the team that at the time. Cassandra has done this amazing work in developing the PA-BAT over the Adrian region. So we had lots of information and experience on using this tool, and we said, okay, let's do it. And we presented the tool to the Parks Authority. They liked the idea, and it took us a lot of back and forth with the Parks Authority to make them understand and to give a local context to the tool. So that's a very important process that has to take place, which is understanding the tool and understanding how those questions are made and how the information that results from the PA-BAT process is integrated into management. So coming back to our research project, so we had this question, how to plan for climate change in protected areas. So that means also how to deal with conservation under climate change. And then we then ask a second question, how do effective conservation of nature, biodiversity, and ecosystem services can be maintained under a climate change scenario? So in this case, PA-BAT resulted as a tool to understand how key ecosystem services can change over time under climate change. And the process of using the PA-BAT also revealed us values that are important for people and how those values can change over time with climate change. So I'm going to give you just a brief example. One of these values is one of the parks, and I'm talking about one of the mountain parks, has a glacier. I am from Colombia, so I didn't introduce myself. My name is Carolina. I live in Colombia. I have been working for the past 13 years in conservation and climate change. And one of these parks has a glacier. And in the Ecuador, having a glacier is very rare. And as you know, the tendency and the trend is that we are seeing the glaciers of these ever glaciers is reducing over time. And we estimate that in the next 20 years, hopefully not, hopefully science is wrong, but very possibly in the next 20 years, we won't see any snow in those peaks. And when we did this analysis of the PA-BAT, we realized, or people realized, that one of the values is a scenic value, and it creates also an identity value of people with those type of ecosystems, and it's going to change. And one of the sad things is that really there's nothing we can do to maintain the glaciers, but what we can do is to create measures to prevent, for example, tourism to go into those places, and create some strategic actions to protect more those places from other type of activities. So that was the context where we used PA-BAT in this project called Conservation Futures. So this is some very interesting information. So what has happened later? So we used only 2 protected areas, or 2 cases, one in an Amazonian region, and the other one in a set of protected areas in a region that is very important for water supply to different cities in the country. So we had quite a broad idea on how PA-BAT could be used in the country in different contexts, and having in mind the different adjustments the tool needed to go through to be implemented. So that happened between 2016, 2017. We are today 2022, and what has happened next? So first, the PA-BAT has been adjusted even more by the Parks Authority, by WWF, and it has been integrated as a tool for all the protected areas under the green list. So it's being used under the procedure of the green list. And Another more sustainable and interesting result from using the PA-BAT from this first experience was that we could influence a tool that national parks in Colombia use to analyze the effectiveness of protected areas management with social participation. It's called IMAPS, and it's a tool that is used every certain time to check the effectiveness of management and the state of conservation in protected areas. So the good news is that, again, PA-BAT has been included into this tool, adjusted to make it perhaps more quicker to do. But the idea of using perceptions, of using people's perception to understand the value of the benefits of protected areas remains, which is the core of PA-BAT, remains there. So these are good news from what we have done in the past and remains until now. A third case, and this was me explaining the tool to other type of stakeholders under my own initiative, and I say, okay, we have to run PA-BAT in a city because we need to see if people think and relate in a different manner and in protected areas that are inside cities, inside an urban context. So I partnered with the Humboldt Institute, which is a government organization, with an NGO, and we basically called the stakeholders, organized a workshop in one day, and we did it, and it was great because there was a lot of connection with this protected area, which is the forest reserve in Bogota. So those of you who have been to the city, there is a big mountain that goes from the north to the south of the city, which is absolutely big. And it's like a reference point to understand where you're placed, where are you, if you're lost if you see the mountain, you know where is the south, where is the north. The reason why I proposed this to Humboldt Institute was to understand how people really is relating to nature in urban environments, because we know, and I think many of the audience, of the people that is connected right now, have seen that cities have grown in an unsustainable manner, that nature has not necessarily been prioritized in urban planning. And we know that in our Latin American countries, because we have seen that. And in some cases, and some special cases, such as Bogota, that they have set this forest reserve 70 years ago as a protected area, it remains there. But otherwise, it would have been built all over the place. So having in mind that cities have been growing in a disorganized manner, but having also in mind that in other contexts, such as the European context, where cities have, for example, Berlin, where I was living and where I wrote this guide that I will just share with you what it is about, you can see that cities play a big role for biodiversity, for pollinators, for birds, even more when the surroundings of the city are completely transformed into agricultural fields. So asking the question on urban nature is becoming increasingly important in any context, both in Latin American countries, developing countries, and developed countries. So having that experience and the results, and understanding that people relate from a very personal perspective, from an identity perspective, from a social perspective with protected areas, and going through a research process on how would be the best way to include nature in cities, I wrote this guide, and the PA-BAT was like the starting point to understand where nature is standing in cities. And this guide, and it's only in Spanish, but it's a guide to include nature-based solutions in cities, and of course with a big approach for Colombian cities or South American cities. And it proposes as well to use PA-BAT to understand how people and what are the values that are important for urban dwellers related to nature and the benefits they are receiving from nature. Finally, and this was a recent work I did last year with New Zealand. So they reached out to me because of our PA-BAT publication. A Colombian was working in New Zealand, and she said it was the guide was very interesting to a process they were developing. So New Zealand was interested, or is interested in, expanding the network of marine protected areas, and furthermore, they're interested to understand what are the benefits of these marine protected areas. So this company, a research company, asked me how PA-BAT could be a tool to make that assessment possible. So we worked together to prepare a bigger benefit or bigger toolkit where PA-BAT is part of it. And one of the, and this is where I think PA-BAT is very special. It's because it really enables you to adapt the tool to your context. And here in New Zealand, the most important question and the reality was that it's important for the marine context to integrate the Maori knowledge, or what they call the Matauranga Maori, into the PA-BAT. And what does it mean? So the Matauranga Maori, or the Maori knowledge, the Maori people have a very special way of understanding nature, understanding how people relate to nature, and how we are all interconnected in a very special way. And this made me think a lot on how in my country, in Colombia, indigenous people see the connection with nature. So Matauranga Maori have different types of concepts, such as, for example, the wakapapa. So it means the connection to the natural environment, to traditions, and to each other is demonstrated in wakapapa. Wakapapa will maintain and celebrate these connections, and will confirm the commitment that resources are protected and enhanced for our future generations. So I think these guys really know what we need to do. But the good thing is that through PA-BAT, we can integrate these type of values into the questions. So that was one of the developments we did in New Zealand. So to summarize, what did we do in each context? First, we adjusted the tool to the context. We analyzed the results, and here there is a richness, incredible richness in all the conversations that happened during the workshop. There's personal experiences, there are scientific approaches, there are institutional approaches. So everything comes to a conversation, which make it the conversation and the understanding of the context much more holistic and much more rich for everyone and for decision makers. And from there, we think on how the results can be integrated and improve management. So these are the three main steps that we went through in each context, except that for the New Zealand one, we only stayed in the design. They haven't implemented yet the tool. And here, just, of course, we don't have as many results as Cassandra was saying, was showing in the different countries that PA-BAT was developed in Europe. But here in the three cases I just shared with you, there is a very interesting finding for us, which is that climate protection and water provision and water regulation came in the three cases as on the top of the list. And even for the protected area in the city, water came as an important value. And we have other values that came also, of course, evident, such as tourism, which was also mentioned by Cassandra, and sacred sites, and scenic beauty, because we have indigenous people in many of our protected areas, or we used to have indigenous people on those places, and now there is this recognition of these sites as sacred, even though there are not indigenous people living there right now. So some food for thought. after comparing these analyses and these experiences over the different examples that I just shared with you. So first, climate, as I just mentioned, climate regulation, water provision are key benefits on the top of the list. Benefits derived from cultural ecosystem services are very, very relevant in both contexts, both in rural protected areas, urban protected areas. And here, health, social integration, identity came as very important values, both in the conversation and in the final graphs. And for rural protected areas, tourism and sacred sites. In all the cases, the PA-BAT inspired a positive conversation, enabled different perspectives and perceptions to be exchanged, and it provided a picture in a specific context and time. So this is very, and I'm gonna close with this one, and PA-BAT has also the possibility to be used in different moments over time. And that will give you also a picture on how the benefits are being used in a specific time and 5 years later as well. So you can compare if your management actions have had a direct impact on the way people are perceiving the values that were identified in an initial stage. So that's it from my side. Over to you, Nigel.
Lovely, thank you very much. Three great presentations. We've got some time, but not a lot of time for questions. I'm sorry, I'm Nigel Dudley. I'm another part of Equilibrium Research. I was involved in this as well. I'm going to ask one question to each of the three of you, and then I want to cut it off at 2 so we still have time for Candice to make her presentation. But starting with Sue, one of the questions on the Q&A, which I think is quite a challenging one for you to answer quickly, but is how we address bias, whether the people in the room, does that bias the result? So could you say something quickly about that, Sue?
Sure, yes, it is a good question. I mean, one of the things to say about the PA-BAT is that it's very adaptable and you can use it in any context. If you're just holding one workshop, obviously the idea is to try and reach as wide an audience as possible. But that might not always be possible in very large protected areas or in protected areas where you've got very different communities. So one of the case studies in the guidance is about an application we did in Turkey, where we had a series of different workshops with different people involved, and we just reported the results from those workshops separately. We didn't try to pull them together. So it was the idea behind the PA-BAT is to get this local perceptions on understanding of benefits. So if you have lots of different groups that have different understandings, you can report that's fine and have different workshops. I think the other thing is that we also, specifically in the generic ARC process, we also had some validation processes where we checked the results to see if there was biases because of people not being able to get there. I remember one workshop we had a problem with a lot of snow, so a lot of people couldn't come. So if you're running this at a site or a national level, you need to use it in a way that makes sense, that can overcome those biases in the best way possible, and there are hopefully lots of good tips and ideas within the guidance that we've produced. Thanks, Nigel.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Sue. Then, Cassie, to you, one of the questions was, this is a huge effort in the generic ARC, 58 workshops in a region that had a major conflict in 20 years previously. Very, very challenging. But could you tell us something about the long-term impacts? There's been any follow-up? What does this mean? Why did you do it?
Hi, thank you for the question. The main idea was for conservation community to understand what's the field ground in a way, because for the first time we initiated any regional collaboration between the conservation experts. So that's initiating the Parks Dine Rides Network, This was a part of this Denari Parks project, one of the strategy to actually assess the baseline, to see the perception, to understand what the PA staff is doing, to understand the how local community perceives protected area, because it's previously protected areas were kind of, not really surrounded by some, a border, but it was kind of really closed. Now it's a time kind of opening for enabling participation for local communities to discuss their issues, challenges, and perceptions with the PA staff, for the PA managers to understand that they are not there only to manage, but also for enable the development. So this was all kind of, process. The results are kind of add on top of that. We have developed this national reports to see where are the gaps on the current PA governance and management systems. And then we have used it as an advocacy material to discuss with the decision makers. There are steps. This assessment has been conducted between 2015 and 2018. It's a large effort, and it took us time to do the reporting, the analysis, but this information is still valid because it really takes time to make a change. But I see the change in the projects, sustainable development happening in the area. So tourism is not kind of ad hoc, it's being developed with local communities. So I think the steps are, there are changes, but they're really slow. But I think the beginning, it's, just initiate communication. And I see the question from a colleague Sibyl on the possible misuse of the data. Yes, it can be, but mainly we have assessed national and nature parks which are protected under law. So hopefully any bad lobbying and interventions will not happen because we have done this for improvement of the PA system. But yeah, it's unfortunately the truth we are living, that nature conservation sometimes it's not on the top of priority of decision makers. But hopefully this tool could be used as a bottom-up approach to kind of listen to the local community voices and their perception and their value.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Answered.
Thanks, Cassie. And then briefly to you, Carolina, from Jelahud in the West Indies. How do we ensure that bringing local stakeholders, the poor, the marginalized into the workshop, which is great, how do we maintain their input later? And have you thought about that in Colombia? And I'll ask you to answer that. I'm sorry, it's a difficult question, but also to answer it quite quickly because we're.
So if I understand correctly, the question is how to keep stakeholders connected to the results?
Or to the whole process, to keeping them in so that their voice is maintained as the project goes forward, as the protected area goes forward.
Yeah, so at least from the experience that we develop in the West Andes in this set of protected areas, so there is a lot of sensibility in that context to tourism, because they are seeing a tourism boom and tourism increase, and tourism is having an impact on natural resources. So one of the ways to keep those stakeholders engaged is to find where, like, you will see if you run the PA-BAT, you will see that certain benefits are more, they require more time from facilitators to stay, to facilitate the conversation where maybe there is more tension. But that's where, for example, in the case of tourism, in the case of this set of protected areas, it's not only the responsibility of national parks, it's a joint responsibility with other stakeholders. So when certain types of benefits are important because they take more time in the conversation, because they are important to generate income, to generate resources, and because it's important for the livelihoods of people. So that's where you can extend the conversation, but with other stakeholders. So I think the agenda in that case is much larger. So for example, when they were saying tourism is increasing too much, and we need more management and guidance from local authorities to know better how we should, create a specific capacity, certain limits, and so on. So I think that's
Brilliant.
to make
Thanks
it
so
short.
much. Thanks. Thanks so much, Caro. So we're just going to finish this this webinar with a quick look at how we can take this understanding of site-based benefits a step further. And if any of you were with us last week, we talked about this CBD report that we published in 2001, which looks specifically at economic benefits. So taking things a step further from looking at just minor, major and potential to actual real money linked to a protected area's conservation objectives and values. But one of the things that the problems that we found in doing this report was there's a real lack of standards for reporting economic benefits. A wide range of different reporting approaches. So we also have a wonderful colleague in South Africa, Candice, who we worked with to try and develop some basic recommendations around reporting on economic benefits. And we published this in this paper in IUCN WCPA's journal Parks. But I'm going to hand over now to Candice to do the last presentation, just to present our recommendations. And Candice, please say hello. And then we'll have a short panel at the end of that if you have any specific questions about this specific paper. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Sue. It's fantastic to be able to join this conversation, and greetings from South Africa. My name is Candice Stevens. I head up Innovative Finance and Policy for Wilderness Foundation Africa. At a regional level, I chair Africa's Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition, and my aim and drive is really around the development of innovative financial solutions for landscapes. And then at an international level, I co-chair the Sustainable Finance Specialist Group for IUCN WCPA with my co-chair, Charles. So it's really, really great to be part of this conversation. I'm very passionate about protected and conserved areas across the board. And one of the things that I note, regardless of where you are, which stakeholders you're dealing with, or which landscapes you're in, is simply that the effectiveness of protected areas often is hamstrung by the fact that we don't have sufficient financial resources to plow back into those critical areas. And so when we look at economic benefits and we talk about standards, it's really important to be able to measure them and to know how much does it actually cost us to manage these areas? How much do these areas generate in terms of revenue and economic benefit? Who do those benefits go to? Do they come back into the park? Do they go to beneficiaries in and on the outside of these areas? And if we can have standard reporting requirements, even a minimum standard, we'll be able to track this over time, and importantly, be able to create new investments, new innovative financial solutions for it. So we've looked, as Sue says, at some of these ideas around recommendations to make this a little bit easier to begin to track and to fully understand. So I think first and foremost, it's really, really important to recognize that all of these areas are different. They have different management requirements, different stakeholders. They offer different types of benefits, not just from an economic point of view, but from a conservation and social point of view as well. And so we need to understand that often you have to have tailor-made approaches to these areas, not just from a management point of view, but from a sustainable finance point of view, a cost management point of view. But regardless of that adaptability and the variability, we still need to look at being able to have some minimum standards to be able to track and report these types of things. So with that, one of the things that's often overlooked and is vital to reporting on economic benefits are cost benefit analytics. So we need to understand how much is it costing us to actually run our areas, our protected and conserved areas. And then importantly, when we have interventions in place from a financial or social point of view, we need to understand what are the benefits that are generated from that, and do the costs outweigh those benefits. We see this in conservation programs, we see it in livelihood development, and we see it even in running finance projects such as carbon projects. So to give you a practical example, there are a number of instances of carbon projects that have been run to develop finance for those protected areas, as well as develop livelihood potential for beneficiaries. And often the cost of running those projects has outweighed the benefits financially and socially. And as carbon markets improve, data improves, technology improves, we're starting to see this turn around. But it's really important to look at that as a minimum standard and as a practice right from the outset, so that we don't end up wasting time and resources where costs outweigh benefits. Then importantly, just some basic principles when looking at economic benefits and how we start to report on them, and reporting on them consistently. So some are reported at gross profit, and others with a variety of different measurables. And so one of the recommendations put forward is to look at net income, which then brings us back to the cost benefit analysis as well. So if we want to be able to report on economic benefits at a consistent level, we need to look at what are the financial results in terms of net income. Where do we come out at the end after all the effort we've put in? Then obviously looking at return on investment. This is something that I really advocate for and advise to build into as many finance strategies and projects around economic benefits as possible, because we're dealing with long-term trajectories. These protected areas need to be there as long as possible, forever. The management is ongoing. Stakeholder and livelihood engagement is ongoing. These things don't just stop. We're not looking at 3 to 5 year cycles, even if funding and donor grants look at 3 to 5 year cycles traditionally. And so we want to be able to show that return on investment. And this can be done for economic benefits from a financial point of view, but it can be translated to conservation and social benefits as well. And we want to be able to put that back to investors, put that back to the private sector, put it back to public finance even, and to governments, as well as to donors and funders, to say this little bit of input that's come in for this interjection has been able to have this type of return on investment, and be able to show that over time and track it over time. Then obviously a clearly defined reporting period is really important. I'm a total tax nerd. I'll own up to that right now. So I always advocate for a tax year. And if it's not a tax year, then a calendar year, or even a period within a year. But those clear reporting periods, which you see in the private sector so much for commercial financial reporting, is something that can easily be adopted for protected and conserved areas. Then another thing that's really important is that you've got different types of beneficiaries when you talk about economic benefits. So you've got direct beneficiaries and you've got indirect or associated beneficiaries. And that creates two different sort of lines or streams of reporting that we need to be able to look at. And those can't be ignored. We want to be able to see if there is an economic benefit that is generated and we're reporting on it at a clear standard within a certain period or time frame, and we know at what measurable we're going to report on it. We also want to know, where does it go? What is it used for? Who does it benefit? So we see things like park fees for protected areas, and I'm sure Africa is not the only example of this, where the park fees disappear into the ether and end up somewhere and don't actually come back into the area itself for management. So who is the beneficiary in that case of that particular economic benefit from the protected or conserved area? And we can see the same when it comes to local communities in and around protected areas. How are they benefiting? Is it direct? Is it associated? And how do we begin to measure those impacts? So one of the things we've looked at in South Africa are measurables for livelihoods. So even when you have value chains that are coming out of a protected and conserved area system, those value chains then have direct and indirect benefit on livelihoods per household, and to begin to measure those and show what those benefits are. Then lastly, and then I'm going to hand back to Sue, we've also got to be able to look at covering conservation management costs, in actual fact, all costs to do with these areas. So we're going to have management costs, we're going to have staff costs, there are going to be different costs that are elevated over different times. So in South Africa, we've seen a massive rise in poaching, anti-poaching costs because of the rise in poaching. As a result of COVID, we've seen across the continent decrease in tourism revenue. And so it's placing strain on staffing and employment costs. And all of these different types of elements, costs, they're going to be standard costs, but they're also going to be costs that fluctuate over time. And we need to actually understand what those costs are and look at projections over time in terms of how much do we need for our protected and conserved areas and the beneficiaries in and around them, and to be able to look at a sort of annual income for protected areas and for their specific activities. And that then gives us a baseline to work from in terms of reporting on what are the benefits, how do we build in cost benefit analysis, how do we show return on investment to attract additional finance, and importantly, what is our gap, our financing gap, that we begin to innovate, pioneer new finance solutions to plug that gap. And slowly over time, we build the sustainable finance journey. So my very last comment is really that finance, regardless of which way you look at it, can't be ignored when we're starting to look at protected and conserved area effectiveness and how that benefits people and planet in and around these areas. So I hope this has been helpful, and I really hope to see some standard measurables coming in so we can track the vast amount of economic benefit that these areas do provide. Thanks, Sue.
Brilliant, thanks so much. Sorry, Nigel, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Candice. That was lovely and clear. And we've got about 15 minutes for discussion before handing back. We've got a hard cutoff date today because we've got someone else waiting. In fact, if they come on earlier, we might even crash out. If we suddenly disappear, that's why, but it shouldn't happen. Ruchia's managing that. So I'm going to start asking a question to you. And one of the things that I really noticed when we were putting together those case studies and talking to governments is that governments are much more interested in these kind of immediate financial gains than they are with these the much vaguer gains, like theoretical value of biodiversity of medicine and so on. That never really sways ministers. But if you can say, look, this penguin is worth this much a year in terms of ecotourism, they wake up. So I'm going to question to you, why hasn't this been done before, and how can we promote it?
Well, yeah, the why question is fascinating. I mean, I said at the beginning of this webinar that, you know, Nigel and I have been looking at these issues for, you know, at least 20 years and looking at the wider benefits, not just economic benefits. But I'm really surprised that we haven't come up with clear guidance before on how to do this. But I guess it just shows you that there is so much to do when it comes to protected areas, managing them, managing systems. You know, we're still finding new things to do, which is kind of quite good if you're a consultant like we are. But I think, you know, that we have, thanks to working with Candice and others, you know, the fact that we have come up with some ideas, and this just went out as a sort of think piece in Parks for people to come back on, and we'd be really interested to A, hear people's feedback on these ideas, and B, ideas at how we can actually get this out further to people to start thinking about this. I think a lot of it, I mean, it's going to come from governments, but it's also about projects. Most of the real tangible benefits from protected areas are from project-based NGO projects. And if we could work more with NGOs, and hopefully this is something that maybe Candice and her group within the WCPA Financial Solutions can work a little bit more on. We need to make the arguments, as Candice said, we need to find the sustainable funding, but if we can't report consistently and adequately on how the funding feeds back into management, then we're really missing a trick. I think, you know, Candice introduced this perfectly and put it probably a lot more succinctly than I did, but I don't know why it hasn't been done before. Maybe Candice has got some thoughts on why it hasn't been done, but maybe now that we have made some suggestions, it will be taken up more in the future.
So maybe I can jump in after Sue, and yes, I have a couple of ideas around why. I think one of them is that traditionally the very traditional conservation sector hasn't had a lot of financial people involved. You know, so I can't step into a landscape, for example, and do assessments in terms of, you know, what standard of management are we at for this particular protected area. but I can tell you how much it's going to cost you to run it and what you could potentially do to finance it. So I think the more integration we have with the financial sector, with a range of expertise, skill sets, from, asset class managers and wealth managers and accountants and all the rest of it, it's really going to build the tools that we have to be able to create these types of standards. And then the other, I think, is also that when we plan conservation projects, a lot of the time they run from hand to mouth. We sit with these traditional donor funding cycles. And so there's not a lot of financial planning, even at a national level for governments, in terms of how much does it cost you to run your protected areas. So one of the things we've had to do from scratch in South Africa is look at per biome, how much does it cost per hectare to protect X many hectares of a protected area. So from the very bottom to actually start to think about costs and how do you finance those costs. I mean, we do this when you think about reintroducing an endangered species. How much work goes into that to know what to do, where to do it, and when to do it. So we need to apply that same type of diligence towards our sort of economic and financial trajectory for these areas. And then I think the very last thing is also around being able to have a strategic outlook on this. If I think about the targets we've set for ourselves and the targets we want to set for 30 by 30 and beyond that, money talks. And that's not to make downgrade biodiversity to money, not at all. It's about the fact that for policymakers, for governments, even the private sector, they will ask you, how much is this going to cost me? Or what is my return? What is my risk? And if we can't answer those questions, then the conversation literally stops. And so we want to be able to state up front, you've got this long, this much risk, this much potential return, even if they're estimates. They're willing to work with estimates, but half the time we don't even have the estimates. So we need to be able to start somewhere so that the conversation continues.
Great, thank you, Candice and Sue.
Nigel, I would like just to share a slightly different insight on that question. And the results that I share with you and the ones we saw that Cassandra shared also showed us that there is a very important value on tangible benefits, which are not necessarily the ones that are traded in the market, in the carbon market or in water. And I think we need to value more well-being. And that's not a carbon credit, that's a happiness credit. And we need to create those happiness credits, because if we keep, I know we have been trying hard to convince governments, giving numbers and creating these markets, but at the end, there's lots of benefits that we are not considering. And we know they are important for us as individuals and for us as society, but not necessarily with a specific price, with a specific money value. And I think we need to change as a society. We need to include in our mindset that well-being is important, and well-being weighs much more than any single penny, any single euro, any single peso, any single currency. And yeah, so I just wanted to say that. Over to you, Nigel.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, I don't think anyone's arguing that we shouldn't have those intangible benefits. In fact, my experience is that often tips the balance in whether something is protected or not. It's whether as much as whether the minister can afford it, is whether the minister went there when they were a little boy or a little girl and liked the place or whatever. So it's very important. But we have another question, which I think I'm going to throw to you, Candice, which is about trust funds and how, or maybe something generally about trust funds, but the specific question was, how can we work out accurate management costs and then get the right mixture within a trust fund to provide longer term funding, particularly in poorer countries where the tax revenue is low and where there aren't any other options. So maybe I know you think about this a lot, maybe some thoughts for you about.
Okay, thanks, Nigel. So on trust funds, one of the things I always say is that there isn't a silver bullet. I wish there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that we could just use to throw into our protected areas, but it doesn't exist. And so what we need to do is be able to create an integrated tool set of different types of financial instruments and solutions that we can then fit together and apply to a specific context. So trust funds are one of those tools. They're not going to be the be all and the end all of financing these areas, but they're one instrument that when you have the right building blocks in place can be really effective to do that. So when it comes down to trust funds, particularly with protected area systems, you can use them to augment public finance. So public finance has a critical role to play, and we don't ever want to detract from a national government's responsibility to put public finance towards its protected and conserved areas. But this can be augmented and supported by trust funds. And if those trust funds are set up in a way where you have all the right building blocks in place, they should be robust enough to start to release finance on a sustainable level to operationalize management costs. And the starting point is then looking at your cost of protected area management. So taking your management plan for a protected area, costing it out, getting your estimate, and how long you'd need to be able to implement that for. In most cases, it's a very, very long time, or at least should be a long time. And that will start to give you an idea of the type of capital endowment you need to put in a trust fund. So what we've seen in the African context, a number of trust funds have been set up without endowments. In other words, they're just sinking funds. Some have been set up where their capital amount, that core inside the trust fund, hasn't been sufficient to continue to create sustainable finance. So there's some really important building blocks that have to be in place in order for a trust fund to be as effective as possible in creating that slow release of sustainable finance to augment public finance and other sources. So I'm happy to share more on that. We've got a number of resources on trust funds.
Okay, thanks very much. That's really useful, Candice, and thanks to everyone. This is for me, this was a really fascinating session. I hope everyone else found it the same way. I'm going to hand over to Ruchir because I know we do have a sharp endpoint. We've got a whole bunch of people in, I think it's either Latin America or Southern Africa, waiting to get onto the IUCN system on the half hour. So I'm going to thank everyone very much for attending, for great presentations. I know people had to take time off and make time out of their own time to do this. So I'm really grateful to all the speakers and also grateful to everyone who's taken part, listened, and asked great questions.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Ciao.